our webinar on Strategic Risk and Crisis Management 2025. If you have any questions, please do put them in the Q&A box and we'll answer them at the end of the session. I'm really pleased to have Dr. David Rubens with us today. David is a CEO and founder of the Institute of Strategic Risk Management, where he's also created a Centre for Wicked Problems, which is a really interesting collaboration. He's also a member of the UK National Preparedness Commission, and he's also authored this book. I don't know if you can see it. So this is a Strategic Risk and Crisis Management Handbook for Modelling and Managing Complex Risks. And it's a really great read. So if you want to follow up with any further information after, I definitely recommend the book. So yeah, I'll leave you in Dr. David's capable hands. Thank you, everyone.
Lauren, thank you for that introduction. Thank you to everybody at the IIRSM for this opportunity to share time with you and your members. Greetings to everybody, wherever you are listening to this right now. So what we've got is about an hour. I'll take about 35 minutes to talk about what I'm going to talk about. And then really looking forward, not just to questions, but to comments and inputs from the people listening to this, involved in this, because I'm sure that there are many people with a wide variety of backgrounds involved in the IIRSM. And I think that we are all coming to terms with the fact that if we claim that we are doing something around security and risk management, the world is a chaotic and challenging place right now. I think that we're all accepting that the nature of change that we are seeing in the world that we're operating in. I'm going to discuss the word unprecedented during my presentation and whether things are unprecedented or not. But there's no question about it that the world is throwing challenges at us that are probably pushing us beyond our comfort zones. And in many ways, stressing our understanding of what risk management is, either to or beyond breaking point. So what I'm going to be doing today is looking at some of the issues around what does strategic risk and crisis management mean in let's say 2025 to 2030. I think that's a reasonable time frame, 5 years. 5 years goes very fast. I mean, 2020, 2019, the beginning of COVID is only sort of 3.5 years away. Today, of course, yesterday was the anniversary, the 23rd anniversary of 9/11. Hard to believe that was 23 years ago. But 5 years in terms of thinking about the risk environment, the global risk environment, the planetary risk environment we're operating in, is a very short time frame. I think there's a parallel time frame of 2025 out to 2050, for example, if you're looking at major city management or major global policies or initiatives, then a 25-year time frame is, I think, reasonable. 25 years may seem a long time, and 2050 might seem as though it's over the distant horizon. But actually, if we look at the people coming out of the universities today with a master's degree, they're 20, 22, 23 years old. In 2050, they'll only be 47, 48 years old. They'll only be coming to the interesting part of their career, the influential part of their career. So 25 years away is not far. But let's, for today, take a time frame of 2025 to 2030, those 5 years. And of course, many organizations have Strategy 2030 or Vision 2030. We had our first conference, the IIRSM conference was in 2019 and was called Crisis 2030. And at that time, it became clear, even then, that was misnamed. It wasn't Crisis 2030, it was Crisis Now. And that was even before COVID, but it was already clear that things were happening that were creating instability in our global frameworks, our global environments, that were creating challenges that we really had to start paying attention to. Climate change was obviously an obvious one. But that had been being discussed probably for 20 years in a significant way. Most people hadn't been paying attention to it. But suddenly these problems that had been thought to be somewhere in the future was suddenly becoming as real as this morning's headlines on the news or in the newspaper. So what I want to do is to have a think about what that means and look at some of the practical and the practitioner and the academic work that's been done around that. And then hear what you people have to say and have a discussion at the end of that. Just to give some context, I've been involved in this for many, many years, but I did my doctorate in strategic risk and crisis management in 2015. I set up the Institute of Strategic Risk Management in 2018, which was designed to create a platform where academics, practitioners, and policymakers could come together and have a grown-up conversation. That's gone very well. We have over 30 international chapters now. Actually, we have more than that. We have chapters in 30 countries. We have more than that because we have some multiple chapters in different countries. We work with major organizations around the world. And I think it's become clear that the ISRM and its approach of bringing together the academic, practitioner, and policy perspectives has value within this global conversation. So let's get into it. Feel free to leave any comments up there. I'll get to those. And I look forward to hearing your comments and questions, inputs and responses at the end. What's interesting is that yesterday, of course, was the 23rd anniversary of 9/11. And from a strategic risk and crisis management perspective, modern crisis management started on September 11th, 2001. And if we look back from the perspective of today, prior to 2001 seems like a much simpler period. It was always in black and white, not quite, but it was simpler. The world was simpler, the problems were simpler. It was more linear. It didn't have that level of complexity. If we think about the First World War, we think of old pictures of people riding around on horses and in the trenches and black and white and people with funny moustaches, etc., something like that. It's a parody, but it's not far wrong. It is a different world, a different world. If we think of the Second World War, that is part of our world. That is fighter planes and it is tanks and it is GIs and it is warfare as we understand it. But between the end of the First World War, 1919, and the beginning of the Second World War, 1939, was only 20 years. And that just demonstrates how much change and progress can take place in 20 years. So if we take 9/11 as the start of our understanding that the world is an incredibly complex and interdependent place. Of course, it had complexity before that, but that was a wake-up call. And the truth of the matter is that if you take the 10 years after 9/11, 2001, and you did a algorithmic search of everything that we do, that's the books we write and the papers we write and the lectures we do and the programs we develop and the webinars, etc., etc. And you did a algorithmic word search and created a word map. Then for the 10 years after 9/11, the word at the center of that word map would be crisis. It was an age of crisis. Obviously, 9/11 was a crisis. 2005 Hurricane Katrina was a crisis. 2008, the global financial collapse was truly a crisis. 2010, Deepwater Horizon, BP Deepwater Horizon was a crisis. And then we come to March 11th, 2011, Fukushima, the tectonic underwater plate earthquakes, the tsunami, and then the failure of the security programs at the Daiichi nuclear power station, which released radioactive cloud into heading for Tokyo, basically. And so we had those 10 years of a period, an age of crisis. And then after 2011, if you did that algorithmic search, a new word appeared. And I'm sure it's a word that you all use and we all use all the time. I've used it multiple times today. But the word was resilient. And suddenly we were no longer talking about crises, but we're talking about resilience. And that's interesting. Because if we're talking about crisis, our focus is outside the window, looking outside. But if we talk about resilience, we're coming into ourselves. We're talking about what do we do? And you can have resilient community or resilient society, organizational resilience, personal resilience, economic resilience, psychological resilience, emotional resilience. But whatever you're talking about, it's an inward looking process. And it says, don't worry about the issue is not what the event is, but it is how ready are we? And that's interesting. Now, from my perspective, most of the people using the word resilience, I think, were using it in an inaccurate way or incomplete way, but that doesn't matter. At least it had entered our lexicon to describe the risk environment we're operating. But in 2017, a new word appeared on that word map. And it came from absolutely nowhere. There was no build up to it. It was suddenly, it dominated that word map. And that was the word unprecedented. And suddenly in 2017, everything became unprecedented. Unprecedented climate change, unprecedented weather patterns, unprecedented global warming, unprecedented infrastructure failures, unprecedented data thefts. The first time 500 million pieces of data were stolen. And suddenly everything was unprecedented. And I think that's interesting. Because if we think about risk management as a concept, there is a fundamental underlying belief there. And the fundamental underlying belief is that we are living in a rational world, a rational world. And you can observe the past, you can model the present, and you can project into the future. There is a continuum there, there's a continuity, there's a connectivity. What was creates what is creates what will be. Now, of course, there's change there. There's always change, but nevertheless, there's a connectivity and there's a rationality, which allows us to understand or believe we will understand the future. But if we use the word unprecedented, then that breaks that line. It breaks that line of continuity of cause and effect. Now, I think, as is often the case, 90% of the time that people use the word unprecedented, they often mean we weren't paying attention. I mean, for example, COVID was not unprecedented. The lockdown, the global lockdown was unprecedented, but COVID as a pandemic was definitely not unprecedented. There's multiple examples of pandemics in the last 20 years. We've had Zika and SARS and MERS and avian flu and swine flu and Ebola, as well as, of course, pandemic influenza, which is a regular part of our national cycle, life cycle. So I think that if we are to prepare ourselves to start plotting or planning or mapping the risk environment we're about to be operating in, and already are to a certain extent, and preparing ourselves for that and engaging with those issues, I think we have to understand or engage with the issue of, are these unprecedented events? Because if we use the word unprecedented, then what that means is we are going through a paradigm shift. And if we are going through a paradigm shift, and to be honest, some mornings I get up and I think we are, and sometimes mornings I get up and I think we're not. So I'm not. I haven't decided on that yet. But if we are going through a paradigm shift, then one of the signs that we're going through a paradigm shift is the fact that the language of the previous paradigm cannot describe the new paradigm. You can't use the language of a typewriter to describe the internet. If all you know is a typewriter, you cannot conceptualize what the internet means. If you understood how a car engine worked in 1930, you opened up a car engine in 1930 and you understood. You said, okay, I understand that. If you opened up a car engine in 1990, you would still understand that car engine. It had changed and it had evolved, but it was fundamentally the same thing. Its concept of what a car engine was the same from 1930 to 1990. If you open up a car engine in 2025, 2024, It's computer chips. It's computer chips. There's no point turning up with a spanner and a hammer and a piece of wire and some pliers if the problem is computer chips. That's a paradigm shift. So what I want to do now is I want to start thinking about what does that mean. So we have a concept called wicked problems. Wicked in this sense is not evil, it's non-irrational. It's problems which we can't even define. Pollution, for example. Pollution is a non-rational problem. Poverty is a non-rational problem. To a large extent, immigration is a non-rational problem. And that's the problem because it's non-rational. Global warming is a non-rational problem. And there are three pillars which I think we have to recognize and grapple with if we are to engage with these issues in a meaningful way. The first is complexity. These are complex issues. They are complex networks of issues. We have to have complex understanding of complexity. The solutions we bring are going to be complex. There are no simplistic or simple answers to these things. And the truth of the matter is many people don't like dealing with complexity and they want both simple and simplistic answers. The second is unprecedented. That what we are seeing, we do not have a precedent to allow us to understand it. So what happens is we are literally feel that we are lost at sea. We're walking towards terra incognita. It is an unknown world. And if on the old maps, where they had terra incognita, unknown worlds, they'd often say, "Here be dragons." Here, and the dragon is the symbol of the unknown and the fearful, the scary. Here be dragon. The problem is that the dragons are now coming out of their caves and are actually coming towards us. And so we're seeing unprecedented events on an increasing scale. And the third pillar I think we have to engage with is non-recoverability. This idea of recovering is usually you survive, you adapt, and you recover. But now we're moving into things where there is no recoverability. Climate change, for example, is creating things that does not have recoverability. And so we have the idea of, well, what does bouncing sort of recovery forward rather than recovery forward into a new state of being, rather than returning to that which was known and safe and familiar. So very quickly, just to give some context and framework, I'm a great believer that we should always look for the context. Context gives meaning, meaning gives significance, significance gives understanding. So if we have context, then we can move towards understanding. And the rational problem is basically we need to have the ability to define it. We need to have the ability to define the problem. And global warming, for example, or even COVID, we couldn't really define the problem. But if it's a rational problem, we need to define it, because if we define it, what we're doing is we're limiting it. We're putting a barrier around it. We're containing it. We're saying, this is my problem. I know that exists, but that's not part of my problem. And so by defining a problem, we contain it, we delineate it. And we have an ability to offer a range of potential solutions. So you have a solutions for what you want to do. We have a solution that is fast, or one that is cheap, or one that is socially and politically acceptable, for example, or one that uses proven technology, or one that supports the development of cutting-edge technology. All of these things are options that allow us to choose which sort of response do we want to have, because there's a range of options available to us. And therefore, we have to be able to define what is the outcome that we want to achieve. Do we want to achieve something fast? Or do we want to achieve something that is dependable? Because you can't do both, usually. If you want a fast thing, then you're going to be having problems which you'll discover afterwards. And if it's dependable, you've got to wait. Now, for example, ChatGPT, it was put out in the market only about 15 months ago, so it seems hard to remember a world before ChatGPT. But the people who put ChatGPT on the market knew that it was not ready for market. It was not market ready. But they wanted to get first mover advantage. So they put it into the market saying there'll be a multitude of problems, and as we go forward, we will fix it. It's a bit like putting the plane into the air half built and say, we'll build it as we fly. But that's what they chose to do. And finally, you have to have the ability to model the outcomes of the choices you make. So there is a connectivity between the choices you make and the outcome. And then you have a rational picture, and you can make your choices based on whichever characteristics are most advantageous to you, whether it's political advantageous or economic or social or whatever it might be. But if we look at irrational problems, wicked problems, then we have to use not just a different recognition, but a different terminology, because there's inability to define the problem. How do you define COVID? Is that a medical problem? Is it a social problem? Is it an economic problem? Is it educational problem? Is it an international problem? Is it financial? Is it about mental health? Is it about children's education? Is it about keeping our borders open? It's all of those things. And there's no way of knowing the outcome of potential solutions. So there's no way at the beginning of COVID of knowing whether lockdown is right or not right, or what the secondary problems from lockdown might be. But once you've said, let's say, for example, as Sweden said, they said, we're not going to go into lockdown. Japan says we're not going to go into lockdown. We're going to trust our people to behave properly and maturely in a grown-up way. Once you've done that, you can't 6 weeks later go back and say, I'm sorry, that didn't work. If you introduce for example, educational policy and all schools follow that, and 2 years later you realize that's not working or not doing what we expected it to do, you can't go back and pretend those 2 years didn't happen. So any solution just creates a new generation of problems. So, for example, one of the solutions to COVID, potential solutions, it wasn't a solution, but responses was to go into lockdown. Okay, you go into lockdown, but then that creates mental health problems and problems with education, a massive problem with increase in domestic violence and other stresses and pressures, which are now coming out 3, 4, 5 years later. And there is no end position. You can't say that's finished. The impacts of COVID, those 4 years, 3 years of lockdown, will be felt across this generation and the next generation at least. So what that is, that's an overview of what we mean, where the difference is between the rational problems and the irrational problems. So let's now bring it down into the real world. Let's think about how that impacts on us. Because what we want to do, if we are security and risk managers, fundamentally what we're trying to do is to create a rational picture of a fundamentally irrational world. We're trying to put structure and framework around an incoherent and an unstructured world so that we can engage with it. And so we start off with incidents and major incidents. We start off with something like this. This is a little doggy. It's cute. I hope you're smiling when you see that. Most people would smile. And it is fluffy, and it is sweet, and it is cute. And, to be honest, you'd like to have that around, wouldn't you? I mean, that's nice. And that is a basic incident. That's what a basic incident's like. We get on with it, we deal with it. And then you get that. And suddenly oh my God, now we have to pay attention. Because the little doggy we can control and we don't have to really worry about it too much. This, we're not in control of. This we have to think about, and we have to understand where is our relationship with that jaguar. Because we have now a relationship. We're not in charge. We have a dynamic relationship, and that jaguar has its own agenda, and it has its own trigger points, and it creates its own threats to us. But nevertheless, that would be a major incident. That's something that we recognize and we can deal with. And then suddenly you get one of those coming towards you. And now you go, okay, right. What I thought I knew, I'm not quite sure I knew. I thought I had a deflection program. I'm not sure if that deflection program is going to work when you've got an elephant coming towards you. But the truth of the matter is that in terms of continuity or continuum, these are part of the same spectrum. And as people who are supposed to bring a level of expertise and understanding and experience in dealing with them, we should have strategies to deal with them. And then one day you get one of those. And you go, okay, I was not expecting that. When I got up this morning, I was not expecting that. And I think that we can call that unprecedented. All right? Because if you see one of those coming through Kew Gardens at you, nobody's ever seen one of those before. You haven't, I haven't, nobody else has. So that is definitely unprecedented. But the thing about it is, although it is unprecedented, it is still part of that continuum. It's part of that continuum. And if you understand the dog, the jaguar, and the elephant, then conceptually you understand this dinosaur. Because basically it's the same. It's the same class of being in the taxonomy. There's a body, and you've got a leg at each corner, and you've got a nose at one end, and a tail at the other end, and stuff goes in one end, and stuff comes out the other end, and it walks around, and it eats, and it sniffs at trees, and it goes to sleep, and it gets up, etc., etc., etc. So although this is unprecedented, we also have what's called recognition primed decision making, RPDM, recognition primed decision making. And what that says is, I recognize this. I have never seen one of these before, but I have familiar, it makes sense to me. I have logically and conceptually, I get it. And that is incredibly significant in the world we're living in. Because if we are talking about unprecedented events, our job is not to manage unprecedented events, but to find pattern recognition. Because a crisis is not defined by the scale or the scope of the event. It's defined by the fact that we lose our sense making. We lose our feeling of familiarity. And so what we have here is unprecedented plus recognition prime decision making. If we know these three, we recognize this. We can't use that to deal with jellyfish. That would not help us. We would not have tactics or strategies for a jellyfish or locusts or a swarm of bees. Those are different parts of the taxonomy. Those are different things. And therefore, would we have the ability to recognize a global, for example, if the oxygen literally turned poison on a city level, which is quite possible to do, and we're getting very close to it on a number of occasions already, or this sort of post-nuclear apocalyptic scenario, or something like this. Those are different. But the truth of the matter is that those are not the situations we are facing. And the story we have to tell is, what can we do about it? What can we do about it? What can we bring to the game that allows us to claim that we can engage with these issues in a way that helps maintain the safety, security, and well-being of our societies and our communities and our organizations, etc., etc. And what I'll do is, and this is my final slide, this is the slide I will show. Because you will all notice, this is from the UK Cabinet Office briefing, open access, COVID deaths. I think this was in 2021, I think. But what you see is that at the top, there's a whole bunch of countries which are similar, and at the bottom is South Korea. Now, if you take the countries at the top, they all have a very similar distribution frame. So the likelihood is statistically they're following pretty much the same path. They're within will be acceptable variant. China, to be honest, we can ignore because nobody believed China's figures anyway. But the problematic line is the one at the bottom, South Korea. Now, if you've got 8 or 10 countries at the top and South Korea at the bottom, there's a number of possibilities. The first possibility is there's an error. There's an error. There's an error in the system, and somebody put in 10,000 rather than 100 and just screwed the numbers up. I mean, that's the first thing you think about. The second thing is they're lying, and the figures they've given us are not correct because it doesn't make sense. It doesn't make sense. But actually, that was not the case. Actually, those figures were correct. And therefore, you have to ask, okay, what is the differentiator? Because that is absolutely statistically relevant. What was the difference? And the simple difference was recognition, prime decision making, pattern recognition. In 2019, in November 2019, word came out of Wuhan in China that something bad was happening. And the people who needed to know about this, epidemiologists and the such like the World Health Organization, they knew absolutely something bad was going on. And on the 1st of December 2019, the World Health Organization sent a high-level delegation to Beijing. They met with the Prime Minister and they said, what is going on in Wuhan? This is pretty damn bad. And as we know, Wuhan went into lockdown. This idea that you put a city into lockdown was unthinkable. And then it started moving out of China, and then it came into Europe, and then it came to Italy and Spain in February 2020. I think we had our first death in the UK around the 7th of March 2020. But the truth of the matter is, and the reason that that line is there for South Korea, is that for the 4 countries of Southeast Asia that had been through SARS and MERS in 2003, so that's a coronavirus pandemic 20 years or 15 years earlier, 16 years earlier. And those countries are South Korea, Taiwan, Hong Kong, and Singapore. There was pattern recognition decision making. There was sense making. There was a feeling of familiarity. Now, that was only 15, 16 years before the outbreak of COVID-19. So there was thousands of people around who've been involved in research and committees and inquiries and working groups, and they've been on local councils and in government ministries and research centres and universities and community centres. So the reason that that line is there was because when word came out of Wuhan, China, that something bad was happening, to these people, there was a familiarity. And therefore, COVID was exactly the same thing as it was for everybody else. But for them, it was no longer a crisis. They downplayed it into a major incident. Why? Because there was some rationality to it. And the countries of Europe that were supposed to be good at this stuff, quite simply, did not pay attention. They did not pay attention. Let me just try if I can get rid of that. Sorry. I want to make sure what I can do here. Okay, stop sharing. That's what I want to do. So fundamentally, what we are trying to do in this increasingly chaotic and challenging and irrational world is we're trying to find sense making. We're trying to see pattern recognition. And the truth of the matter is that any crisis should be unique, because you shouldn't be having a crisis for the second time. In 2019, I think it was in 2019 when Gatwick Airport had the first drone problem. And there was a drone outside Gatwick, outside the perimeter fence. Gatwick closed down for 3 days. 6 weeks later, there was a drone at Heathrow. They closed down one runway for 20 minutes and then reopened. Why? Because there was something that they could compare it to. They had an understanding. Was in the first one, it was just, oh my God, where are we? There's no familiarity. So I think that us, and when I say us, as a community of people who claim to have insight and expertise and capability in strategic risk and crisis management, and who are responsible for maintaining the safety, security, and well-being of our communities and our organizations, I think the ability or the recognition of the need to develop this pattern recognition, this recognition prime decision making, is critical. Because there is no doubt that the world will continue to throw at us challenges that we have not experienced before. One of the major challenges is around just the increased heating of the world. I was in Saudi Arabia in about, I think, 1998, 1999, and it was 42 degrees. And I wrote at the time, I thought 46 to 48 degrees was absolutely the limit of human capacity. That human beings could not live at places beyond 48 degrees. Now, 50 degrees is absolutely normal. It's just background temperature. We have 40 degrees in the UK. I was speaking to somebody from the EU earlier this year, and I said, what is the plan to manage Europe at 40 degrees? Because you need a plan. Europe is not designed to run at 40 degrees. You know, our roads aren't designed for that. Our railways, our airports are not designed. Computer systems. If you look at your laptop, your own laptop, and you look at the largest computer systems in the world, 80% of the power in that laptop, in that computer system, is used to cool it down. I mean, that's just to keep it cool. But it's designed to keep it cool at 20 degrees, not at 40 degrees. So I asked him, what is the plan to manage Europe at 40 degrees? He said, man, we haven't got one. We haven't got one. I mean, seriously, we don't know. I mean, nothing in Europe's ever been built to manage at 40 degrees. We don't know. That doesn't mean it's not going to happen. It's just mean we're not ready. And in any fight, being ready is 80% of the game. Being ready allows you to be in the fight. So I hope that this has been interesting and of use to you. I think the question to be asked is not whether something is right or wrong or good or bad, but whether it is useful or not. I hope it's been useful. But I hope also that it might inspire you or trigger you to start thinking about some of the ways you manage risk or you model risk within your own organization. And if it is of interest, I'm always happy to have a chat with you. I hope that through the IIRSM, we can do some more work together. Because the world needs people who takes this seriously. And there's not enough of us. So thank you to everybody today. Thank you to the IIRSM. Thank you to you who are listening today. And I hope that at some stage we'll continue the conversation now. And at some stage we can meet in person and continue the conversation over a coffee or a beer. But today, Lauren, thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you ever so much, David. Does anyone have any questions at all? So I think we've got one in the question and answer box. So Gordon, oh, I'm sorry, I don't know your first name.
Oliver, I think that might be Oliver. Might be Oliver. If it is Oliver, great to see you.
A very thought-provoking presentation. Thanks, David. I do wonder whether some of the events that we have witnessed are truly unprecedented or perhaps unexpected, planned for. A notable exception being the quality and volume of misinformation. If that were the case, perhaps this speaks to your opening remarks regarding resilience and its interpretation or application. I'd be interested to know your thoughts here and whether, if this were true, that actually this requires a whole of government approach to ensure
That is you, Oliver. Great question. As always, thanks. I agree. First of all, I think that the word unprecedented is massively overused. And I think most people, when they talk about unprecedented, what they mean is we were not paying attention. I think when people, it's a bit like driving. If you're doing an advanced driving program, if you're to be an advanced driver, the two real skills you need are, first of all, read the road ahead. And the better you are, the more you read the road ahead. And the more you read the road ahead, the better you become. I just don't think we're very good at reading the road ahead in terms of the risk environment we're moving into. I don't think that we're very good at reading the road ahead. The second skill is to be smooth, maintain smooth movement. Don't be jerky. Not fast, not slow, smooth. And I don't think we're smooth either, because to be smooth, then you have to have that feeling of where we're going and an understanding of the environment you're operating in. So I think we are both short-sighted and jerky in terms of what we do. So I absolutely believe the fact that what we call unprecedented is just a lack of ability on our part to do risk management properly. If you talk about things like misinformation, then what's happening is you're now putting the malicious intent into play. And there is no question about it. Things like ChatGPT has changed the way that we engage with information completely. Social media had done that already, of course, but social media was relatively simple and simplistic. Misinformation and disinformation. Misinformation is bad information. Disinformation is a deliberate use of misinformation to achieve aims, often in terms of disrupting the target audience or the target society, or whatever it might be. I think that is one of the most significant things we have in our lives right now. I think we have no idea or understanding of how significant that is. I've seen people create me. And At first, I wasn't quite sure. It's not 100% right, but it's a hell of a lot better than it was 6 months ago. You can see the improvement on a month-to-month basis. So to come to your final point, yes, it absolutely needs an all-of-government approach. But the all-of-government approach is not to tell everybody what to do, but to support the development of the all-of-society approach. I think we've moved from all-of-government to all-of-society. And if you bring in this concept of resilience and it finishes off with societal resilience, then we have to have an all-of-society based thing. At the beginning of COVID, the IIRSM, we set up a coronavirus campfire, which was, well, those times twice a week, an open Zoom call. Anybody could call in from anywhere in the world. We've just had number 289. Tomorrow we're having number 290, I believe. So it's been going for a long time now. But we said in the third week of COVID that this has to be community-led. The response to COVID is not led from central government. It has to be at the community level. And the role of central government is to support and enhance the ability of communities to look after their people. That never happened. But I think we have a much better understanding now that genuinely we have to have an all of society resilience. And to do that, we have to create a healthy society. Resilience is very much like getting fit. It's very difficult to get fit if you're fundamentally unhealthy. And if you think that our society in many ways is fundamentally unhealthy, and it may be that you disagree with that, that's fine, then it's very hard to build resilience over an unhealthy society. And so I think we have to look at this in terms of a strategic, conceptual way. And of course, if we are to bring those changes in, those are multi-generational. I mean, that's not done in 6 weeks or 6 months. That's over a generation and another generation. So good question, great question. I'm a consultant, so it's a short question, long answer. What can you do? And at the end of it, the answer is I don't know. I mean, there's a long way to go around and say I don't know. But good question. Thanks.
So we have another question from Malcolm Hazel in the chat, and we've also got a hand up from Roy. We'll come back to you, Roy, if that's all right. So Malcolm Hazel's question is, does Dr. Rubin see social media and the use of it acts as an accelerant to the average person's perception of global disasters or unprecedented incidents?
I think there's undoubtedly a bias within the algorithms to bad news. You know, if you just put something in there and see where it's like water, see where it floats to or where it rolls to. I think if you just put something into the internet and you put a click and you click and you click, I think you go to bad rather than good. And if your propensity is to look for bad, then that is multiplied and that is leveraged up to an extent which we've never experienced before. The problem is when we look at vulnerable groups of our vulnerable people in our community, in our society, and I'm particularly thinking about young people here, but it goes much wider than that. There is a propensity to be honest, to go to the dark side. I've seen that in myself. For example, I spent time in Buddhist monasteries. I've done sort of 24-hour meditation sessions. I've done 2-hour headstands. My attention span right now is about 7 seconds. When I'm on social media, if you haven't got me in 7 seconds, I'm gone. I don't think I've ever watched a little video to the end. You know, you watch it, then you go off and go somewhere else. Now, if they can do that to me, and it's done very deliberately, there's some very sophisticated thinking behind that. So if they can do that to me, and I'm aware of it, and I still can't stop them doing it to me, then what are they doing to 13-year-olds and 14-year-olds and 15-year-olds? And I think that it comes down to responsibility, because the people who are designing those programs are very intelligent, educated, nice people who are creating evil in the world. I think there's no doubt about it, they're creating evil in the world. And they're not accepting responsibility for it. So I think that is a massive issue around it. But I do think that the propensity is to the dark side rather than to the light. Yep.
Thanks very much. So Roy, would you like to come on speakerphone to ask your question?
Roy, you would just need to unmute yourself. think Roy may have put his hand up.
Yeah, it might be
without realising.
No worries. So we've got another question in the question and answer box. So Justin Okoli, apologies for any presentation, any mispronunciation there. Thanks for such an insightful presentation, David. I particularly like the way you integrated the RPDM into your discussion. Little question is, if we can't practically prepare for every possible incident at the planning and preparedness stage, is it then fair to blame organisations for being ill-prepared and poorly organised in the event of a crisis?
We have this concept of no blame. But no blame is not the same as no responsibility. If you look at Grenfell Tower and the report that's come out about that, the reason that 72 people died in Grenfell Tower was because there was a multi-year and maybe multi-decade collusion between Royal Borough of Kensington, Chelsea, the regulatory authorities, the builders, the architects, everybody else, who all knew what they were doing and did it anyway. And there was collusion there. As that report says, this did not have to happen. And that's true for pretty well every thing we look at. You look at the Horizon scandal, for example, with the post office. Or you look at the blood, the haemophilics and the blood coming out. Or you look at going back a few years, the horse burger scandals. Or you look at Boeing 737 MAX. Or you look at Volkswagen and the emission scandals. You look at Fukushima. If anybody is interested, I'm happy to share that through the IIRSM. But if you look at the executive summary of the Kiyoshi Kurokawa report into Fukushima, it says absolutely that this is a man-made disaster. And it's based on collusion about people whose responsibility was to create safety and security and actively went against that for their own benefit. So the truth of the matter is that I'm a great believer that if we have that as our responsibility, then that is the responsibility that we have. And the problem that we have at the moment is that we allow people to walk away with no ownership or no ownership of that. If you had this discussion in America, if you were discussing this with American organizations or within an American context or audience, there's a word that they would use that we almost never use in the UK. And that word is liability. And as soon as you talk to any organization in the States, the first question is, okay, what's our liability? What's our exposure? What's our liability? And that keeps people on. In America, people go to jail. Here, people don't go to jail. I think they should. I think some of them should be hung from a lamppost, to be honest, because they've killed people. No question about it. What happened in Grenfell was as close to murder as you can get. If you put petroleum-based cladding around 2,500 buildings in the UK, you didn't know that Grenfell was going to go on fire, but the likelihood that one of those buildings is going to go up at some stage, absolutely, it's built into it. So in terms of responsibility, there's two ways that you can build excellence. The first way is you just keep striving to achieve excellence. And you look for incremental, what the Japanese call kaizen, continuous improvement. And you look for incremental improvements all the time, which is excellent. But the much easier way is stop doing stupid stuff. Stop doing stupid stuff. And the truth of the matter is that as organizations get bigger and more complex, they have a high level of dysfunctionality baked into them. If you're involved in large organizations, complex organizations are incredibly dysfunctional. But in terms of responsibility, the first question should always be, who owns the problem? Who owns the problem? And if you don't know who owns the problem, that's the problem. That's a problem. Because then nobody owns it and it falls between the cracks. Complexity is useful. It brings advantages. But additional complexity doesn't. And if you look at a system that is overly complex, then the likelihood is that people are already starting to plan to avoid responsibility. So I think that it comes down to this idea. If you look at this concept of high reliability organizations, zero failure organizations, there's a whole load of technical stuff around that. But the fundamental belief of a high reliability organization is the acceptance of the responsibility of risk management. And if you look at all those examples which I've mentioned, you look at Grenfell Tower, you look at Horizon, and you look at DP Deepwater Horizon and Volkswagen and Boeing 737 MAX, those were not accidents or failures or errors. They were people running their organizations in a way that created those inevitable risks. And I think people should be held responsible for it. And I think if they did that, then we could make a difference in the market.
I think we've got one final question from Yusuf. How can we fill the gap between risk management scholars and the risk management policy making?
Well, we're doing that already. We have this concept now called pracademic. I am proudly a pracademic. That is practitioners who then have academic insight. And there is no question about it. One of the reason I set up the IIRSM, to be honest, was because when I finished my doctorate, I realized that 98% of the people in the world responsible for strategic risk and crisis management in government agencies and ministries and the World Health Organization and the OECD and the World Bank and Deloitte and KPMG had no familiarity with the amazing academic work that's been done around all of this. And what a familiarity with the academic work does, it doesn't solve your problems, but it gives you a framework to discuss complexity. It gives you a framework. And if you don't have that familiarity, there's a phrase in Chinese, which is a dog chasing flies. And what it means is you have no strategy and no plan. You just chase flies and randomly, whatever lands on your nose, you chase that. And at the end of the day, you've got no flies. In my opinion, the UK government in COVID was a dog chasing flies. I never, ever felt that I knew where the strategy was or the plan was. I never felt that they knew where the strategy or plan was. So I think that what the academics can do is they can bring an academic structure, framework, and discipline to the conversation. And if anybody is interested in that work, can I just give a little plug for the IIRSM? We have on our website, we have an open access library with over 100 papers on all academic papers on all aspects of strategic risk and crisis management. Feel free, please, to go in there and have a look. You'll be delighted. In our members section, we've got about 400 papers, but we have 100 papers public access. Go in there. I think you'll find things that will be of interest to you. And hopefully will add some value to what you're doing. Yep. Thank you.
Thank you ever so much. So I personally would like to thank David for his talk today and for answering all the questions. Thank you all for attending. Before we head off today, I've just got one little notice. So the recording of these webinars are no longer going to be hosted on our YouTube channel from the 1st of October. They're going to be put on the IIRSM Members Resource Hub. So if you want to have a look for those, that's where you'll find them in the future. Thank you ever so much. We'll see you all again soon. Take care.
Thank you to everybody. All the best.
Bye for now. Bye.
Thank you, Lauren. Thank you to you and the team. It's perfect.